Welcome to Double Black Diamond. This is an expert level class. It is logical reasoning only. We have more questions on the agenda than we can get to in an hour. I'm pretty sure it's going to take more than an hour. Sorry, we're scheduled for an hour. It'll probably go something like 90 minutes. I just want to make sure that I do full explanations for all these questions. I am excited because we're going to do six, of these official licensed questions that appeared on the actual LSAT in their day. That's what we're going to start with. But the bonus questions at the bottom of the syllabus today are brand new questions that Ben Olson wrote as a challenge for me. So Ben wrote them and Abigail has vetted them, and I have never seen them before. And I'm going to do my high wire act and attempt to answer them without ever having seen the answers before. And we'll see how good those guys are at writing questions. I have a feeling pretty good. If it passed Ben's muster, if Ben wrote it, and if it also passed Abigail's sharp editing eye, I have a feeling they're going to be pretty good. So I like a challenge, and should be fun to see how good we have gotten now at writing our own questions so that we're not limited to just the ones that come from the Law School Admission Council. You can raise your hand at any time during class and I will call on you. It's under React in the Zoom client. You can also put questions and comments in the chat. I see you guys talking about, hey, I was wondering, why did these questions not have explanations? Yeah, it's because they're brand new, literally last week, written by Ben. So we're going to tackle those questions at the end of class today. I got to get one thing on my mic here. There we go. Get my pop filter in place. All right, here we go. I'm just going to do explanations for these questions. Hopefully it'll be clear. If it's not clear at all, your job is just to raise your hand and say, hey, here's something I don't understand. In general, it's one of the most important things you can do in your LSAT prep, especially because you're a Demon Live subscriber. You should take advantage of the opportunity to talk to me and Ben and all of our amazing teachers and TAs. When you're in class, if anything doesn't make sense, class is the time to ask your questions and make sure that you're getting to full clarity. So I hope that you will do that today. All right, here we go. Scientist says a number of errors can plague a data collection process. Okay, so I read that and I go, okay, well, like what? Tell me, give me an example. Since examining the collected data enables researchers to detect many of these errors, it is standard practice for researchers to correct collected data. Okay, so I was expecting examples of these kinds of errors. Instead, they just say, sometimes we fix these errors. Okay, still don't know what kind of errors you're talking about. Could be like, I don't know. I'm just imagining duplicate data, or maybe somebody, like orders that, numbers that are clearly off by a factor of 100, like they meant 100% and they put 100, and then that change, it changes the meaning, and maybe that's something that you can note that and you can fix it. I don't know, and it doesn't really matter. The specifics of the errors don't really matter here. Just there are errors in data collection, and since they are detectable, it's standard practice to correct. Okay. However, says this scientist, in my field, there is a striking tendency for such corrections to favor Jones's theory. That is, the majority of corrections result in the corrected data as being closer than the uncorrected data to what Jones's theory predicts. Now, the scientist's use of however there is a little bit of editorial flavor, which makes me think that maybe this scientist is skeptical of Jones, or maybe this scientist is skeptical of the data correction procedures. Maybe this scientist thinks that the data correction is biased in favor of Jones. But there is an equally plausible interpretation of these facts, which is maybe Jones is correct. Maybe Jones's theory is correct. If Jones's theory was correct, then I would expect that any data corrections would tend to go in the direction of Jones's predictions because Jones's theory is correct. You see how there's two different competing possible interpretations here? I'm just thinking things through. Which one of the following, if true, most helps to explain the tendency of corrections in the scientist's field to favor Jones's theory? In other words, why does the data correction tend to move in the direction of Jones's theory? Again, I've got two possible explanations. One, it's totally biased. Like Jones wrote the data correction procedures so that it just always corrects in the favor of Jones. Jones could be the biggest scientific criminal that ever existed, and he could have just totally, bought off the data correction or whatever. Alternatively, Jones is totally right. Her theory is 100% correct, and she had nothing to do with biasing the data correction. It's just that she's right. And so when we correct data, it tends to support her predictions. A, researchers normally give data that is in line with a theory the same weight as data that conflicts with that theory. This ain't going to do anything. If it's not biased one way or the other, then how does that explain that it goes in the direction of Jones's theory? The answer can't be A. If it said that it gives more weight to something that's in line with a theory, then I would say, oh, it's biased in favor of the theory. That's an explanation, but A doesn't explain it. B, researchers in the scientist's field give data that conflicts with Jones's theory greater scrutiny than they give data that is in line with Jones's theory. Oh, maybe the process is biased in favor of Jones. That's basically what A says. That's basically what B says is, they give it greater scrutiny if it conflicts with Jones's theory. So when it is in line with Jones's theory, they don't really look at it. But when it conflicts with Jones's theory, they look at it and then maybe they correct it in Jones's favor. B seems like a satisfying explanation. I think the answer is going to be B. C, researchers in the scientist's field are more likely to pursue lines of research that they expect will favor theories they accept than to pursue other lines of research. I mean, that's not even about data correction. So if that's not about data correction, then how can it explain this thing about data correction? No way. D, even if researchers fail to detect errors in a data collection process when they examine data that they collected, that does not guarantee that no such errors exist. I mean, it's about data correction, but all that says is, yeah, sometimes there's errors that we don't catch. So why do the errors that we do catch, when we correct them, why does it tend to favor Jones's theory? D doesn't explain anything. E, researchers in the scientist's field have formulated several other theories that attempt to explain the same range of phenomena that Jones's theory attempts to explain. How does that explain why the data correction is biased in favor of Jones? Or how does it explain that the data corrections tend to go in Jones's favor? B is the only one that explains why this process favors Jones. The answer is B. Martin has a question.
Hey Nate, so I liked your prediction and I predicted the same thing initially. However, I did pick C on this one. And my reasoning for it was because of the initial prediction of the bias was I interpreted C as somewhat saying that there was some form of bias initially because they did favor the theories that expected to, pursue that they would accept then wait, I'm sorry. They expect will favor theories they accept. So on that basis, I thought that there was implying a bias, you know, element within this process.
All C is not about data correction.
Okay.
It's about how people choose initial areas of research. So all C really says is scientists tend to pick projects that seem like they would agree with the outcome. Like if I think, you know, I have a feeling that law schools are trying to charge every individual student as much as that student seems willing to pay. Okay, if that was my theory, then I might choose a research project that was like, well, let's do a bunch of fake applications to law school. And in some of the personal statements, I'll make it sound like I'm rich. And in other personal statements, I'll make it sound like I'm poor. And then let's see how much they try to charge me to go to that school. That would be choosing a line of research that I expect will favor a theory that I accept instead of pursuing some other research project.
Oh, okay.
But it has zero to do with data correction and why data correction favors Jones.
Okay. Okay. That makes sense. I guess I must have interpreted it that the wrong way, but yeah, I guess I should have seen B with the biased aspect. So thank you.
Yeah, I mean, how did you not pick B as well, right? It's like, okay, so you misinterpreted C and chose it, but then what's your rationale for not choosing B, which actually matched one of your predictions and is about data correction? So it's like you didn't really use your backup parachute there. You know, you were just like, oh, that looks like a good answer. I'll pick it. Okay, yeah, but what about this other answer that also was good that really did actually match one of your predictions? You know, it doesn't seem like you're being careful enough there to eliminate wrong, to be sure that you're correctly eliminating wrong answers. Hannah,
Yeah, I chose B because I felt like even though they gave it scrutiny, I didn't know why that scrutiny meant that they were going to change or correct the data in favor. It seemed like just because they gave it scrutiny didn't necessarily mean that they would do what the stimulus is saying. I understand now why it's more right than C, but I still feel like it doesn't exactly say what we were predicting.
it does though. I mean, you can read it to say exactly what we were predicting. By greater scrutiny, what that means is they just look at it more. Like a cop who looks at someone of a certain skin color more than they look at someone who's of a different skin color. Like biased policing is giving one person greater scrutiny than giving another person scrutiny. Or TSA, who, you know, sometimes they're going to like give you the full examination, and other times they're just going to, oh, yeah, whatever, just pass on through. Greater scrutiny means you're looking at the data more closely, means you might catch things more often than you would if you were giving it less scrutiny. See that now? Thank you for your questions. Anybody have any follow-ups before we move on to this next one? Make sure you keep asking your questions so that you can get that click. The right answers are really, really right, and the wrong answers are really, really wrong. And I want to convince you of that fact, that this test actually makes sense. It's valid. It's not bullshit. It's not, oh, it's just a matter of interpretation. There's one right answer and there are 4 wrong answers for every question on the LSAT. Construction contractors working on the cutting edge of technology nearly always work on a cost plus basis only. Okay, so what is a cost plus basis? Maybe you have that knowledge. It is a real thing in the real world. In fact, I'm reading Elon Musk's biography right now. What a weird guy. But they constantly talk about the difference between cost plus contracting and what SpaceX or Tesla does. Okay, so you don't have to have that knowledge. Okay, so we've got no knowledge here of what cost plus basis means, but we do know that construction contractors who work on the cutting edge of technology almost always work on a cost plus basis. One kind of cost plus contract stipulates that the contractor's profit as a fixed percentage, stipulates the contractor's profit as a fixed percentage of the contractor's costs, semicolon. I'm going to stop there. You should use punctuation as a stop sign, not just periods. I mean, a period is a stop sign, but a semicolon is also a stop sign. And you can stop there and you can go, well, let me think about that now. it stipulates the contractor's profit. So if you are a construction contractor working on the cutting edge of technology, maybe you're building rocket ships, you could have a contract that says you get a profit as a fixed percentage of your costs. Now, right away, I go, so you mean if I inflate the shit out of my costs, I also inflate the shit out of my profits? The other kind stipulates a fixed amount of profit over and above costs. Oh, so in that case, my costs are essentially irrelevant. I just make X profit. So then I don't have, I think, an incentive to inflate my costs. Of course, I also don't have any incentive to cut my costs. Under the first kind of contract, higher costs yield higher profits for the contractor, which, yeah, I am capable of figuring that out. That's what they told me. So this is where one might expect final costs in excess of original cost estimates to be more common. And I mean, that seems to make sense to me that if you're going to give people a profit based on a percentage of their costs, then if they inflate the costs, they would be inflating their profits. So yeah, it seems like some shady folks would artificially inflate the costs. So you would expect that that might be the place where there would be higher cost overruns. Paradoxically, though, such cost overruns are actually more common if the contract is of the fixed profit kind. And I would stop there and I would scratch my head because, I acknowledged when I read the description of the two kinds, I did acknowledge that in the latter kind, fixed profit kind, that I really, as a contractor, don't have any incentive to reduce my costs. But I also don't have an incentive to inflate my costs. So why would it be that there are more frequent cost overruns in a fixed profit contracting arrangement than in a percentage uh, of costs arrangement? It's going to be a paradox question. Which one of the following, if true, most helps to resolve the apparent paradox in the situation described above? Very predictable. Once you spot the paradox in the given facts, and I mean, they told you paradoxically, right? So you knew that they were going to ask you to resolve this paradox. Once you spot that, you know that that's the type of question that's coming. Now I just need an answer that, if true, will explain the paradox. It should be a satisfying explanation. I should feel it should like scratch the itch where I go, oh, I see. A, clients are much less likely to agree to a fixed profit type of cost plus contract when it's understood that under certain conditions, the project will be scuttled than they are when there is no such understanding. What? So that just says you're more likely to end up in a fixed profit type of contract if you understand that under certain conditions, like what conditions, the project would be scuttled, which means like stop the project. Hey, I agree with Robert. We're going to scuttle this answer because I just don't understand it. And I expect answers to be wrong. Every answer has an 80% chance of being wrong. So I read that. I don't really understand it. It doesn't feel like a satisfying explanation, at least on the first read through. A's out. B, on long-term contracts, which long-term, were we talking about long-term contracts? I don't think we were. Anyway, it goes on, says, on long-term contracts, cost projections take future inflation into account, but since the figures used are provided by the government, they are usually overestimates. Terrible answer. It does not provide any explanation of a difference between fixed profit or percentage profit cost plus contracts. C, on any sizable construction project, the contractor bills the client monthly or quarterly, so any tendency for original cost estimates to be exceeded can be detected early. But again, I am supposed to be explaining a difference between fixed profit and percentage profit contracts. That's two different types of cost plus contracts. C isn't about any kind of a difference between, I need a difference between the two types of contracts to explain the difference in cost overruns between the two different types of contracts. C doesn't even mention the two different types of contracts. There's no way that could be the answer. D, clients billed under a cost plus contract are free to review individual billings in order to uncover wasteful expenditures, but they only do so when the contractor's profit varies with cost, which it does in the percentage profit arrangement. In the percentage profit arrangement, if I inflate my costs, I inflate my profits. But D says that's when the client is going to really look at your invoices. If that wasn't my deal, if I'm just getting a fixed profit, then according to D, the client goes, well, they don't have any incentive to inflate their costs, so I'm just not going to bother looking at their costs. And if that were true, then it could totally explain why there are cost overruns more frequently in the latter type of contract. It's an excellent answer. I'm going to end up picking D here. I got to make sure I can get rid of E. The practice of submitting deliberately exaggerated cost estimates is most common in the case of fixed profit contracts because it makes the profit as a percentage of estimated cost appear modest. But that makes the paradox worse. Why would there be cost overruns in a fixed profit arrangement if E were true? If E were true, I'm already inflating my costs as part of the estimate. But the paradox is about why are the estimates wrong? Sorry, why are the actuals compared to the estimates wrong? And if E is true, then if I'm on a fixed profit deal, I've already jacked my costs through the roof because it makes my profit look small. But then I wouldn't have overruns when I actually run the project because I already would have artificially inflated my costs on the estimate itself. E is a very commonly chosen wrong answer. People choose it almost as often as D. The solution, though, is that E actually makes the paradox worse. So as you review this question, if you're stuck on E, the thing to take away is E makes the paradox worse. If E said that this type of exaggeration is more common on a percentage contract, then it would solve the paradox. But since it says that this practice of deliberately exaggerating cost estimates is most common in the case of fixed profit contracts, it makes the paradox worse, not better. Answer here is D. Chalet.
I was gonna ask if you can re-explain why E is incorrect. I'm having a hard time understanding why it worsens the paradox.
Because if E were true, and I'm on a fixed profit deal, then I'm already inflating my estimates. I'm inflating my costs when I make the estimate. So then if I get the deal, my costs aren't going to overrun the estimate.
Okay.
They're less likely to because I've already artificially inflated my costs on the estimate itself. The paradox is about why are we overrunning estimates?
But not the original estimates, like additional estimates?
No, there's an estimate and there's an actual.
Oh, okay.
Why are the actuals higher than the estimates? But E says if I'm on a fixed profit deal, my costs on the estimate should be artificially inflated. Do you see how that makes the paradox worse?
Yes.
Good. So E is on target. It's just that it makes the paradox worse instead of making the paradox better. It's really close. If E were saying that the estimates are inflated on percentage deals, then it would solve the paradox. But instead it says that the estimates are inflated on fixed profit deals, which then makes it even harder to understand why the actuals are over the estimates on fixed profit deals. Angelina and then Al.
Hi. So in the passage, it says that fixed incomes are the amount of profit over and above costs. And when I was reading it, I kind of got caught up on over and above costs because I didn't really understand what that meant. So I was wondering if you could kind of explain it again and then also give me some advice because I feel like sometimes when I'm reading these questions, if I don't understand exactly what the LSAT means when they're saying something a little bit more complicated or in a way that just doesn't make sense, I'll get a little bit hung up on it. So I was wondering if you had any advice about, taking it apart a little bit.
Sounds like you're overthinking it maybe a little bit.
Yeah, I
Costs
think I
means
am.
costs.
Okay.
I mean, I don't know. Costs means how much did it cost you to do the project?
Okay.
So on
I
a
wasn't
fixed
sure if it was
profit,
only,
go ahead.
I wasn't sure if it was only like a fixed amount of profit above, I don't know, the cost, if it was like almost not a percentage, because I knew it was fixed, but if it was a fixed amount only when it got to some type of cost. So I do think I was overthinking it.
It just says the contractor's costs.
Okay.
So that's probably materials and labor. I don't know. Insurance, if they needed to buy insurance,
Mm-hmm.
Whatever they spent to do the project, I would imagine is their costs.
Okay.
It's the LSAT uses dictionary definitions of words. It doesn't always use the first definition, but it uses, established definitions of words. And I don't think that means anything fancy there. It just means how much did they spend when they did the project.
So what does over and above mean?
It just means over, more than.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, the test is much more common sense based than you guys think. I mean, the easiest way to miss this question is to not read the definitions carefully enough and to not understand what the paradox is. If you thought that the paradox was, well, the estimates are too high on fixed profit deals, that's not what the paradox is. They were talking about, I mean, it said in excess of original cost estimates. They told you everything that you needed to know here. You just had, and this is true of the LSAT in general, is that this test makes sense on the page. Okay. We all have to just get better at reading the page. That's not just for Angelina, that's for all y'all. L?
Yeah, okay, so I kind of have two things. First, I just wanted to check number B is like wrong because it's not making like there's no distinction between the two. It's just showing something that could be wrong for like both of them.
Yeah, unless if they don't bring up the two types of cost plus contracts, right? And it's basically percentage, or is it just fixed? And if they don't bring up that difference, or if they don't provide an answer that only applies to one type of fixed cost plus contract, if the answer doesn't make a distinction, then how the hell can it explain the difference?
Okay. And then so on D, whenever I was reading it, I think I maybe had a similar problem to Angelina, but whenever I was reading D and it said contractor's profit varies with cost, I thought that it referred to the fixed amount because I thought it was like, okay, so like say that your fixed profit is like $500, no matter like what the costs are. So I was like, okay, if you have $500 and your like profit and your costs are 1,000, that's like 50%. But then if you have like $500 profit on like a $3,000 cost, that's like a much smaller profit. So I thought that that's what it was saying whenever it said
It is.
profit. Oh, well, then wouldn't it refer to the fixed amount of profit instead of the other one?
Oh, I see what you're saying. No, because your profit hasn't varied. Your percentage profit has varied, but that's not what D meant. D was referring to if your profit varies with your cost, which it would in a percentage deal.
Okay.
Like profit means how much money did you make? And it is true that sometimes we think about profit in terms of percentages, but that's not what D meant.
Okay.
When it says when the profit varies with the cost, they're talking about how many dollars are you taking home, not what was your percentage profit.
Okay. Okay,
See it
thank you.
now? I want to make sure that I answer Christian's question in the chat. Christian said, can you go over why D is correct again? And I chatted back. I said, it's about scrutiny. And it is. It's about, just like the previous question was about scrutiny. If you're looking closer at the data when it violates a theory, then your data correction is going to tend to support that theory. With D, you're looking closer at the costs when the contractor's profit varies with the cost. That's going to tend to keep the costs down. But they're not giving that same scrutiny to the fixed profit deals, which is why they end up with cost overruns more often in a fixed profit deal. Okay, got the light bulb on for Christian. Anybody else? These are all coming to us from the ask button, by the way. Kelly has a question.
I just had a quick question. I'm sorry. I was just wondering, I chose B because I felt like that was the only, not B, sorry, D, because I felt like that was the only way that the cost overruns could actually happen, because I was feeling that E didn't necessarily mean that they went into the contract. I don't know if that's the right line of reasoning as to why I'm choosing it as well, because I was also confused looking at E, and I see how it's making it more complicated, but that was kind of my rationale.
No, E actually makes the paradox worse. It makes it harder to understand why we would have overruns on a fixed profit deal than we would on a percentage deal. Because if E's true, then if I'm on a fixed profit deal, I already am overinflating what the costs would be on the deal because I want to make my profit look small. You know, I decide in advance, okay, so I want to make $10,000 on this. So I'm going to say that it's going to cost me $1 million to do it. And then they're going to write me a check for $1,010,000. And the $10,000, you know, it's only 1% of $1 million. So it looks like I'm barely making anything, but I've already inflated my costs to $1 million. If that were true on a fixed profit deal, then why the hell would I be overrunning my estimates on the actuals?
Okay.
Doesn't make any sense because I've already inflated them according to E. So E actually makes it harder to understand why we would have overruns on a fixed profit deal.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Very
Thank you.
common. Thank you for asking that question, Kelly. It's a very common type of wrong answer on a paradox question. If there's ever a second best, I mean, it's not second best because it's 100% conclusively wrong. But it's a common type of wrong answer that can be really tricky to avoid because it's clearly on target. I mean, it does something to this paradox where a lot of the other answers just don't do shit to the paradox. But E does something to the paradox. So it's like you register, oh, that does something. Like that affects this paradox. But the problem is it plays for the wrong team. We were trying to solve the mystery. E actually it directly hits the mystery. It's just that it magnifies the mystery. It makes the problem worse, not better. D is satisfying. D, you go, oh, I see. So the client is really looking at the invoices on the percentage deals. And if they're really looking at every invoice for every item on the percentage deals because they're worried that the contractor is going to inflate those invoices, then that would tend to keep the costs down. So that solves the paradox. E makes the paradox worse. Attorney says, I ask you to find Mr. Smith guilty of assaulting Mr. Jackson. Sounds like the attorney is speaking to the jury here. On an assault charge. looking for a guilty verdict. This is the prosecutor. Regrettably, there were no eyewitnesses to the crime, so acknowledging nobody was there to see it. But Mr. Smith has a violent character. What are you going to say? Mr. Smith is a boxer. Mr. Smith plays violent video games. That's some pretty thin evidence. Really? You're going to use character evidence to try to convict my he's a deacon of the church? I just go immediately into defense mode here. Mr. Smith has a violent character. Oh, how do you know that? Well, Ms. Lopez testified earlier that Mr. Smith shouting loudly had threatened her, and Smith never refuted this testimony. Wow. So what you're saying is because my client yelled at someone, therefore, wait, because my client yelled at Lopez, therefore, my client has a violent character? And not only that, but therefore must have assaulted Mr. Jackson. So there's really two conclusions there. The first one is violent character. And then the second conclusion is because of the violent character, must have assaulted Jackson. Hopefully you can see how terrible this argument is. I mean, I yell at you guys all the time. Well, I'm not really yelling at you guys. I'm yelling at the LSAT, but oh, Nathan, he's super violent. He must have assaulted this guy over here because he yells all the time in his LSAT classes. So he has a violent character. So therefore he assaulted whoever says that they were assaulted. Also, the fact that Smith never refuted the testimony doesn't even mean that Smith did it. Maybe Smith just was like, okay, that's a terrible accusation. Like, why would you even need to refute that testimony? It's not even in evidence that Smith yelled at Lopez. But if Smith did yell at Lopez, that does not necessarily mean that there's a violent character. And even if there was a violent character, that does not mean that Smith assaulted Jackson. So I got like 3 different objections here. The attorney's argument is fallacious because it reasons that what? So which one of these did it do? I can see 3 possible answers here. 1, you've assumed that anything that was alleged and not refuted actually happened. 2, you've assumed that if I yelled at someone, I have a violent character. 3, you've assumed that if I had a violent character, I had to do this specific assault. Any one of those is something that this argument does wrong. And that's what we're looking for again on a flaw question. A, did it reason that aggressive behavior is not a sure indicator of a violent character? Wait, didn't it do the opposite of that? I mean, yelling is probably aggressive behavior, right? And they're saying because Smith allegedly yelled, therefore Smith has a violent character. So the not makes A 1000% wrong. B, Smith's testimony is unreliable since he is loud and aggressive. I don't know that Smith ever testified. It doesn't say that. I don't know that Smith ever said, I didn't do it. So how can I pick B? Smith's testimony is not in the record here. C, since Smith never disproved the claim that he threatened Lopez, he did in fact threaten her. Yes, this argument did do that line of reasoning. It said Lopez alleged this, it was not refuted, and then it just assumes must have done it. And that's one of the 3 flaws that I spotted in this argument. And I don't have to pick all the flaws here. I just have to pick anything that they did wrong. And they did see, and it's wrong that they did it. So that's the answer. D, Lopez's testimony is reliable since she is neither loud nor aggressive. It did not provide evidence that Lopez is not loud or aggressive. It just never provided, that's not reasoning that this argument actually did. It just presented her testimony without commenting on her character. E, did it reason that having a violent character is not necessarily associated with the commission of violent crimes? That seems wrong exactly the same way that A is wrong. The not makes A wrong. The not makes E wrong as well. Answer here is C. Questions? L.
Okay, so whenever I did this question, like C jumped out at me. I like immediately like knew it was the right answer, went through, rolled everything out. But then whenever I was on E, it wasn't really making sense. And so I just kind of ignored it because C was like clearly the right answer. But I'm still kind of not really understanding what E is saying. And like, well, actually, okay, if the not was in there, wouldn't it like kind of be the opposite? Like, wouldn't it help the argument? I'm just not really understanding E. Maybe it's not necessary to understand E, but
Okay, so a couple things. Wrong answers are wrong. Wrong answers don't have to make sense. It's okay not to understand every single wrong answer. Sometimes you're going to read that and just go, what? How's that doing anything? But I don't think that's really correct to do with E, because if you take the word not out of E, it becomes having a violent character is necessarily associated with the commission of violent crimes. I think that that fairly describes one of the flaws of this argument, because they said because Smith has a violent character, Smith must have assaulted Jackson. That seems to be saying that if you have a violent character, then you do violent crimes.
okay. I was not putting that together. I don't know why, but that makes sense now. Okay.
Cool. So it's the not that makes E wrong. I really think that it's that one word. If that one word not wasn't in there, then I feel like there's a really strong case for E. You'd end up with two correct answers, though, because there's a perfectly strong case for C. But the LSAT doesn't do that. The LSAT never puts two good answers. The LSAT only ever puts one correct answer and four demonstrably wrong answers. The thing is, you don't have to be an LSAT teacher and disprove every single wrong answer. So if you saw an answer that you thought does it, and you read every word of that answer and you're fine vouching for that, you're like, yep, it did this. It's a problem that they did it. I think the answer is C. Then all you really have to do is just kind of check off D and check off E. You should read it enough, but be careful. There's a fine line, because this is the only place that we get to go fast on the LSAT is by dismissing wrong answers. But if you do it too hastily, if you let yourself not understand too frequently, then once in a while you're going to maybe miss a question because you did though make another mistake on that same question, which was you picked a wrong answer. It's kind of a balancing thing, right? How sure am I that this is the answer? Then how deep do I need to dig into this wrong answer? If you're not 100% sure about the answer that you're about to pick, then maybe you need to dig a little bit deeper into each wrong answer to make sure that they're wrong.
Okay, thank you.
Van Willigen says, some have argued that professional athletes receive unfairly high salaries. Okay, so like every old man, looks at the contract. Oh my God, Ohtani's making $700 million. That's so unfair. And it's like, okay, yeah, but the Dodgers are worth like billions and billions of dollars. So some have made this argument. But in an unrestricted free market, such as the market these athletes compete in, salaries are determined by what someone else is willing to pay for their services. Of course, we could have a side conversation about whether this is truly an unrestricted free market, because the leagues do conspire, don't they, with salary caps and et cetera. It's actually not really a free market. I mean, probably these athletes would make more money if they really did have free agency. Anyway, Van Willigen seems to think that these athletes are in an actual free market. So that's what they're willing to pay. These athletes make enormous profits for their team's owners, which I think we all know in real life is true. And that is why owners are willing to pay them extraordinary salaries, which I think we all know in real life is true. But now they reach their conclusion, and my job is not to agree with conclusions. My job on the LSAT is to disagree with every conclusion that is made, unless the evidence proves it. And the conclusion here is, thus the salaries they receive are fair. But they never defined fairness. They do not have a premise in this argument that says, if the owners are willing to pay it, then it's fair. Or if we're looking at an unrestricted free market and someone's willing to pay it, then it's fair. That definition, fairness, was never in evidence, only in the conclusion. So as much as I want to argue with every old man who says, oh, it's not fair, that's, it's ridiculous how much money they make. And I agree that it actually is fair and they probably should be paid more. I want to agree with that, but that's my job. If I want to get the question right, I have to interfere. I have to find the thing that's going to get in the way of, okay, here's your evidence, here's your conclusion. I'm going to tell you why your conclusion doesn't necessarily follow from your facts. My objection here is, what the fuck is fair? Where did fair come from? What? You didn't provide any definition of what's fair. You're just assuming that it's fair because of a bunch of facts that you gave, but the facts don't say anything about fairness, so how could they prove that it's fair? Van Willigen's conclusion follows logically if which one of the following is assumed. That question is asking me to prove Van Willigen's conclusion. It's a sufficient assumption question. Sufficient assumption questions are easy because they are predictable. How do I force this conclusion to be true? Well, what's the problem with the argument? The problem with the argument is that they bring up fairness in their conclusion, and they never mentioned fairness in any of their facts. So the correct answer here absolutely has to say something about fairness. And what it's going to do is it's going to take us from the facts we have, which is unrestricted free market, owners are willing to pay, to the conclusion that we want, which is therefore fair. So the correct answer could just say, if you're in an unrestricted free market, then every salary is fair. It could also say, if the owners are willing to pay it, then it's fair. A, the fairest economic system for a society. I'm not even going to read the rest of that. I want something that applies to contracts in an unrestricted free market. I don't care what is a fair economic system for society. I want a definition of fairness that says, if you're in an unrestricted free market. So, if I eliminate B, C, D, E, I might end up coming back to A, but I know that A is wrong 80% of the time. So I read the first little bit of it and I go, yeah, that's not the kind of definition that I was looking for fairness. I can just say, probably not A, probably never come back to it unless I can eliminate all four of these other answers. B, if professional athletes were paid less, I might stop reading that one right there. What? Like counterfactually, if they were paid a different price than something else? Yeah, why do I need to read the rest of that? Again, I'm looking for a bridge from the facts that we have to the conclusion that we want. C, the high level of competition in the marketplace forces the team's owners to pay these high salaries. Who cares? Doesn't mention fairness, can't be the correct answer. D, any salary that a team owner is willing to pay, here we go, for the services of a professional athlete is a fair salary. Hopefully some of you, if I could get an amen in the chat, I would really appreciate it. Hopefully some of you are starting to predict these answers on sufficient assumption questions. Like, you brought up new shit in your conclusion, Van Willigen. You're not allowed to bring up new shit in your conclusion. And if they say, okay, but you're Van Willigen's attorney and you need to prove Van Willigen's conclusion, okay, well, then it has to say, if the facts are true, then the conclusion is true, and the conclusion is about fairness. D is perfectly predictable, and it's the answer. E, if a professional athlete's salary is fair, well, I know that that's wrong. Let me take a little more time to explain why. E, at best, is going to be confusing sufficient for necessary. I'm trying to prove fairness. E says, if it's fair, then here's some other shit that would happen. But what if it's not fair to begin with? So I really don't need to read the rest of E to know that it's wrong. There's no way that it can be right after that comma. Yes, L, it would be confusing the causal arrow, although we don't diagram conditional reasoning here. Your life will be easy. You'll be better off, trust me, if you don't diagram. Okay. It's just not the best way to solve these questions. I used to teach diagramming, so please trust me, for, 5, 7, 8 years of my career teaching LSAT, I had a whiteboard and I was always doing the diagramming of conditional arrows because that's how I had learned it. But it's also just common sense. We're trying to prove fairness. E says, if it's fair, then here's what happens. I want if so-and-so happens, then it's fair. And that's just not what E is doing. Answer here is going to be D. Angelina.
I feel like you answered this, but if E said if a salary is determined, then the professional athlete's salary is fair, then that would be correct, right?
Oh, yeah.
If it's switched the two.
And another way to make it correct is if it said only if a professional athlete's salary is fair, is it determined by what an individual is like. So there's a difference between if and only if, but they said if it's fair, here's what happens. But I'm trying to prove that it's fair. So it's like you're starting at the destination. I can't start at the destination if I'm building a bridge to the destination.
Could you explain how that is confusing sufficient for necessary a little bit more?
It's just, you understand the difference between if you're in Manhattan, then you're in New York City.
Yeah.
Okay. Does that mean that if you're in New York City, then you're in Manhattan?
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Okay.
It's just common sense. And you really don't need a whiteboard in order to prove that, right? I don't need to diagram that. I don't need to do the contrapositive. I don't even need to say the word contrapositive if I don't want to. I have a goal of making LSAT Demon a contrapositive free zone. You don't have to think about the contrapositive. It's common sense. Okay. If you're in Manhattan, then you are in New York. That's a fact. But that doesn't mean that if you're in New York, you have to be in Manhattan because there's 4 other boroughs.
Thank you.
Reese.
So going off of that, would the objection to E then be like, salary can be fair, like it can be fair whether it's determined by an individual willing to pay for it, because it could be like a different type of reasoning why it could be fair. Am I making sense on that? I picked E. I'm just a little confused.
E says if it's fair, then the salary is determined by what an individual is willing to pay. But I already know that the salary is determined in these cases by what an individual is willing to pay. That's a fact. So E can be used to prove if we know that it's fair, then here's what it'll look like. But we don't know whether this is fair in this case. Say I'm trying to prove that Mr. X is in New York. There's a rule that says if you're in Manhattan, then you're in New York. I'm trying to prove that Mr. X is in New York. If an answer says Mr. X is in Manhattan, then okay, that proves that Mr. X is in New York. Sorry. Well, that's a bad example.
I personally know my shortcomings, and sufficient assumption and necessary assumption I keep confusing. So that also is just kind of on me.
Well, the other thing is that you're probably conflating the two issues. Sufficient and necessary as a logical concept is as simple as if you're in Manhattan, then yeah, you're in New York. But if you're in New York, that doesn't necessarily mean you're in Manhattan. Okay. If you understand that, and by the way, maybe you've never been to New York. If you're in Topeka, then you're in Kansas. But that doesn't mean that if you're in Kansas, you're in Topeka. Okay. If you understand that, then you actually understand the difference between sufficient and necessary as a logical concept. And you don't really need to know more about conditional reasoning.
The crazy thing is identify confusing sufficient for necessary and like flaw questions, but when it comes to a sufficient like assumption question or a necessary assumption question, it's like I can't
Right. But
differentiate
let me
them.
finish. Let me finish. You're overthinking sufficient assumption and necessary assumption questions. They're not the same thing. We got to separate those two issues. I think you do, Reese, understand, yes, the difference between a sufficient condition and a necessary condition. You know that Modesto means you're in California, but that doesn't mean that if you're in California, you have to be in Modesto. You know that that's not true. Thank God. um, I was trying to shit on Modesto there. Sorry, I'm from Modesto. But sufficient and necessary assumption questions are a totally different deal. Reese, can you explain to me in 20 seconds what's the difference between a sufficient assumption question and a necessary assumption question? I mean, what are we looking for on a sufficient assumption question?
Sufficient doesn't have to necessarily be true, from what I've
No.
gathered.
Nope. You don't know the difference. You don't know the definitions. And I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be mean, Reese. I'm trying to be direct. Okay.
No, I like it. It's okay.
Good. Sufficient assumption questions. They are asking you to prove the author's conclusion. That's all you need to think about. This is a sufficient assumption question. My task is to prove the author's conclusion. Definitely don't start, like you said, necessary, like 3 words after I said, what's a sufficient assumption question? You're confusing the two issues. Sufficient assumption questions are about proving the conclusion of the argument. Necessary assumption questions are about finding an answer that must be true according to the author. They are two very different tasks, even though sometimes they can have common ground. There are common solutions where something will be both sufficient and necessary. The example of that is if a party costs $10, then $10 in your pocket is both sufficient and necessary. It's sufficient because if you have the 10, then you have enough to get to the party. It's also necessary because if you don't have 10, then you can't go to the party.
So just so that I'm retaining this, so sufficient, I want to make the argument win.
Yes.
And then necessary, treat as like a must be true.
Yep. 100%.
Okay.
That's all you need to know about sufficient assumption and necessary assumption questions.
Would you think it'd be helpful to like just drill sufficient and necessary and try to figure out if I can differentiate them?
Maybe, and we have had live classes that do that. If you go back and search through the catalog, you should find plenty of classes where they only do sufficient necessary assumption questions. You can also restrict your drilling in the daemon to just sufficient and necessary assumption questions if you want. But I wouldn't bother doing a lot of that because there are a lot of sufficient assumption questions and a lot of necessary assumption questions. And if you just do drilling, you will encounter those. Also, you have to be able to read the question and figure out what type of a question you're doing. So if you limit yourself to just those 2 types of questions, then you might stop even reading the question anymore. And that's like not really helping you as much as you think. Clara, and then I got to move on to another question.
Yeah, just really quickly, I wanted to just double check. E's wrong also because we're trying to prove fairness and like wouldn't starting off saying
Exactly.
something fair is just like assuming the conclusion already.
Exactly. Exactly. And that's exactly why I was able to get rid of E just like that. I'm like, I'm trying to prove fairness. E says, if it's fair, well, yeah, but I don't know whether it's fair. That's my whole point here, is that nobody, like you concluded that it's fair, but I'm trying to prove your conclusion that it's fair. When an answer says, if it's fair, then here's what happens. Well, that's obviously backward because I needed, if the facts are true, then it's fair. Good. Very good, Clara. All right, let's keep it moving. Some planning committee members, those representing the construction industry, have significant financial interests in the committee's decisions. Okay, so, they have skin in the game. Get it. I got it. No one who is on the planning committee lives in the suburbs. Oh, geez. Okay, so although many of them work there. Okay, but so the first part of that has to apply to even the people in the construction industry. The second part of that, the many of them work in the suburbs, that may or may not apply to the people who are in the construction industry. There's very little link in between the two facts, but I know that there are some people who have significant financial interests, and I know that none of them live in the suburbs. So I could link those two together, and this is probably going to be the correct answer. It turns out to say, if the statements above are true, which one of the following must also be true? So what can you prove from those facts? And you really can't prove very much, but I can prove that there are people on this committee who have significant financial interests in the committee's decisions who don't live in the suburbs. I know that for sure. A, no persons with significant financial interests are not in the construction industry. Wait, so you're saying everybody with significant interests is in the construction industry? I don't know that. I know that there are some people on the committee who are in the construction industry who have significant financial interests, but there might be a million other people who have significant financial interests both on and off the committee. I don't know. B, no person who has significant financial interest lives in the suburbs. Well, I know that that's true of the committee members because none of the committee members live in the suburbs. But again, there could be people who aren't on the committee who do have significant financial interest. That's why I can't pick B. C, some persons with significant financial interests in the planning committee's decisions work in the suburbs. I don't know that. I don't know that. If that had ended with don't live in the suburbs, then I could pick it. But all I know is that there are some people on the committee who work in the suburbs. That doesn't have to apply to the people in the construction industry, so I can't prove C. D, some planning committee members who represent the construction industry do not work in the suburbs. I can't prove that either. I know that they don't live in the suburbs. If you change work to live, I think D becomes 100% proven, but I can prove that they don't live there. I can't prove that they don't work there. They might all work there, as far as I know. E, some persons with significant financial interests in the planning committee's decisions do not live in the suburbs. I predicted that, I think, word for word. It was really the only thing that you could prove from the facts that they gave you. I know there are people on this committee who work in construction and have significant financial interests. I know that no one on the committee lives in the suburbs. So there are some people with significant financial interests who don't live in the suburbs. Who specifically? Oh, well, the construction people who are on the committee. That's why I can pick E. Answer's E. You could do a Venn diagram if you wanted to. We don't teach Venn diagrams here. I think it's overcomplicating things, but I have heard some students say that Venn diagrams help them. Yeah, okay, good. Got it. Questions about that one? It's just a reading comprehension question in disguise. Tamara?
Hi, do you mind going over why B is wrong again?
So B said no person who has significant financial interest in the planning committee's decisions lives in the suburbs. Well, I know that that's true of the people who are on the committee. But B is not restricted to just the people who are on the committee. B says nobody with significant financial interests can live in the suburbs, but there could be a million people who aren't on the committee who have significant financial interests. We just haven't heard about them. And they can live
Okay.
wherever they want.
Okay, I see. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. This is a level 5 difficulty question somehow. I don't really understand how it's so difficult for students because it's absolutely clear. There's one answer here that you can prove, and there are 4 answers here that you just can't prove. The wrong answers here are demonstrably wrong. But I appreciate that sometimes you don't see it, and that's why I really want you to ask your questions because I can make it clearer for you, or at least that's my job. All right, last one of the real questions, and then we're going to get into some brand new shit that we wrote ourselves. We'll see. Finance minister says the World Bank's doing business report ranks countries in terms of ease of doing business in them. Okay. All right. So interesting. What countries are good for doing business and what countries are bad for doing business? In producing the rankings, the World Bank assesses how difficult it is for a hypothetical business to comply with regulations and pay taxes. Okay, so just two things: comply with regulations and how difficult is it to pay taxes. Now, it strikes me that there could be other things involved, like how difficult is it to get financing? How difficult is it to find customers? How difficult is it to find a workforce? But, the World Bank seems to be looking at these two things. How difficult is it to comply with regulations and pay taxes? Since the last doing business report came out, our government has dramatically simplified tax filing for small and even mid-sized businesses. So our doing business ranking will probably improve. Some of you might have spotted the problem with this argument. And in the interest of saving time, I'm just going to point it out here that they are only talking here about small and mid-sized businesses. It's like just attack the evidence. The evidence here is limited to small and mid-sized businesses. What about large businesses? Did it say that we are talking about the World Bank here? That sounds kind of like big stuff. Ranking countries on the ease of doing business. So we made it better for small and mid-sized businesses. Therefore, our doing business ranking will probably improve. The answer to which one of the following questions would most help in evaluating the finance minister's argument: A, if the finance minister's country made it easier for small businesses to comply with regulations, would the rate at which new businesses are formed increase? I don't know. Wait. Okay, so if I knew that was yes, does that necessarily impact the rankings? I mean, actual new business formation, as far as I know, the World Bank's doing business report never even looks at new business formation. So A doesn't, like, whether that's yes or no, I just don't really see it helping me to prove or disprove whether the ranking is going to go up. B, has compliance with tax laws by small and mid-sized businesses increased since tax filing was simplified? Wait, so the actual compliance, again, does the World Bank's doing business report give one shit about actual tax compliance? I thought that they were ranking, here's how hard it is to pay taxes, here's how hard it is to comply with regulations. Whether it does or does not, whether we did or did not actually increase compliance, I mean, that's like how many people are crooks, or it could be how many people are crooks. Maybe our country is just nothing but crooks and the compliance is zero. World Bank could say, oh, you've eased your regulations, therefore the ranking goes up, or maybe they wouldn't. I don't know. B just doesn't help me evaluate the conclusion that was made. C, for small and mid-sized businesses in the finance minister's country, is tax preparation and filing more difficult than complying with other regulations? Wait, so comparing other regs to tax compliance, those things were both in the report. So whether one is harder or the other one is harder, I'm not sure that really is relevant. We made taxes easier. Does that impact our rankings or not? C is just about, well, is taxes harder or are the environmental regulations harder? Who cares? Does it really matter? D, is what the finance minister considers to be a mid-sized business smaller than the hypothetical business used to produce the doing business report? Oh. Now, maybe you made the prediction, maybe you didn't, but if you read D and you spot, okay, hypothetical business, oh, right, it did say that this report was based on a hypothetical business complying with taxes and regulation. Now, would it be interesting to know whether what the finance minister considers to be a mid-sized business smaller than the hypothetical business used to produce the doing business report? Because if the answer to that question is yes, well, then do these changes to the finance minister's country's tax policies actually even affect how difficult it is to pay taxes for the hypothetical business that the World Bank is using? If the answer to D is no, no, it's not smaller. Okay. Well, if a mid-sized business is not smaller, and I know that I've made smaller and mid-sized businesses, I've made taxes better, compliance with taxes better. Basically, what D's getting at is the changes that were made would affect the hypothetical business that the World Bank's doing business report is looking at. And if that's true, then yeah, I guess our ranking will probably improve. But if that's false, then I don't know whether our ranking would improve. So as the answer to D changes from yes to no, my evaluation of the conclusion of the argument changes from good to bad. Therefore, D is on target here. It's helping me to evaluate the conclusion of that argument. E, was the finance minister in office when the last doing business report was issued? Why do I care? What's relevant here is, do the changes that were just made for small and mid-sized businesses actually change the report? D is a good question to ask, because if the finance minister's changes, the small and mid-sized businesses, if those changes were for businesses that were smaller than the hypothetical business in the report, then maybe our ranking won't change. But if that's not true, then maybe our ranking will change. That's why the answer is D. To go over B again, I can do that. Has compliance. Well, so B is about actual compliance. Why is actual compliance? Does the World Bank even look at actual compliance? Like, tax compliance is, did you file your taxes? Did you lie on your taxes? Changing that, like, oh yeah, no, the compliance did improve. Or no, maybe the compliance was already at 100% and it didn't improve. Or maybe the compliance was already at 0% and it didn't improve. Who cares? Is it going to change our ranking in the World Bank report? Stefan?
Hey Nathan. So my prediction for this question was similar, I'd say, but I still failed to get it correct. What I asked myself immediately after reading the argument was, what if 99% of the businesses in this country are all large corporations? And so this assessment of small and mid-sized businesses really wouldn't affect their rankings at all. Because if they're all just basically large corporations, then it does not affect their rankings at all, or it wouldn't have as much of an effect, a very minimal effect. But when I read answer choice D, I feel like it's kind of getting at that prediction, but I just failed to recognize that it was doing so. Does that make
Seems
sense?
like the thing that you failed to recognize was that the World Bank is looking at a hypothetical business.
Yeah,
How hard is it for a
100%.
hypothetical business to do business in this country? So a lot of the wrong answers here were about actual businesses.
Mm-hmm.
Who cares what actual businesses did? Look at the methodology of the actual report. The only thing they tell us is that if there's a hypothetical business, and we're going to see how difficult it is for that business. So the good objection that you could have found here is the hypothetical business a small or mid-sized business?
For sure.
If the hypothetical business is a extra gigantic corporation, a Dow 30 corporation or whatever, then maybe these changes to small and mid-sized business don't affect the rankings at all.
Mm-hmm.
So related to what you predicted, but yeah, D's right on target because the report does use a hypothetical business. And if that's a small and mid-sized business, then the logic maybe makes sense. But if it's a gigantic business, then maybe the argument doesn't make sense.
Yep.
L?
Hi, yeah. So I know that you recommend like not just like to evaluate the logic of questions, like instead of just like having like a specific strategy, but like with questions where it asks you which question would help to like evaluate an argument, is it like a good methodology to find like what question would give you an answer that like when it changes your
Yes.
evaluation of the argument? Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Does it change your assessment of the conclusion of the argument? Would you like to know the answer to that question because it will affect whether you believe our doing business ranking will improve?
Have you ever like done a question where there's been like two answers that do that?
No.
Okay. Thank you.
I mean, there are questions where it seems like one does something and it doesn't. But there just aren't good second bests on the LSAT. It's really not. Like everybody thinks, novices always think, oh, well, it's 55% on this one and 45% on this one. And the reason why the right answer is right is that it's just slightly better than the wrong answer. No, that wrong answer is wrong and the right answer is right. Martin and then Elizabeth.
Nathan, I just wanted to make sure that there is no sufficient for necessary flaw in this argument, because when I was initially reading it and then I got to the conclusion, the idea that their doing business rankings will improve seemed to me like a potential jump in the case that potentially, I mean, it could be the case that it satisfied those two elements, but it didn't, like there could be like a number of different variables that potentially was not satisfied, which would make the argument, the conclusion not follow. I was just wondering if that logic is on track.
Sure. I mean, you could have made an objection like there are other things in the World Bank's doing business report, including how strong is the economy of the country. Or what were my other things? Like how hard is it to get labor? How hard is it to get materials? Um, like there could be other factors, right?
Sure.
And so I feel you that you could have read that conclusion and gone, well, no, not if we just had a major disaster in our country and now you can't get any workers and you can't get any materials. Maybe there are other factors. That said, based on the factors that they gave you and the change that was just made in this country, would we expect that change to influence our rankings for the positive? Well, maybe. If all else were equal, maybe these are the only two factors, right? So you don't know that there were additional factors.
Right.
It could be a flaw question. If this was a flaw question, there could be an answer like you have presumed without warrant that there was not a major environmental disaster in this country.
Sure. Right. Yeah, I suppose that was my initial objection to this passage. Obviously that didn't turn out to be the answer. But it's yeah, I guess I can see what the right answer is right. So
Or on an evaluate question, the correct answer could have said something like, are there other more important factors in the World Bank's doing business calculations or whatever?
sure. Thanks.
That's good. That would be good to know, right? So that could have been the answer on an evaluate question. Elizabeth?
So when I was reading through this, my objection was, okay, so they've given us something about the taxes, right? But we don't know if they've done anything to the other regulations.
Sure.
What if they, lowered the taxes and then raised all the other things?
And there could have been a correct answer that said something like, did the government make any changes relevant to complying with other regulations?
Yeah, exactly. And so I thought that C would be helpful in that. And so I'm wondering if you can help me figure out why that was wrong.
Because C is just comparing difficulty of complying with one type of regulation to difficulty of tax compliance. But just because it's more difficult or less difficult to comply with other regulations in the country, that might not have changed. If that didn't change, then presumably making our taxes easier to comply with would improve our rankings.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah. Nernemsa.
Hey Nathan, thanks for taking my question. Um, so it says here in the argument that the in producing the rankings, the World Bank assesses how difficult it is for the hypothetical businesses to comply with regulations. Um, and so that compliance part, when I was looking at B, I was stuck between B and D, and I saw right there in B has compliance with tax laws by small and mid-sized businesses increased since tax filing was simplified. It kind of maybe not satisfied, but it attacked one of the requirements that the argument had set out, and that's why I was so stuck on B. Can you just like give me more about why I was wrong with that maybe?
The report is based on a hypothetical business, not actual businesses. It's a fact, according to this finance minister, it's a fact according to the argument that the government of this country has dramatically simplified tax filing for small and mid-sized businesses. If the answer to B is yes, compliance has increased, it doesn't really change anything because I already know that the government has dramatically simplified tax filing for small and even mid-sized businesses. On the other hand, if the answer to B is no, it also doesn't really change anything because actual compliance might not matter to the hypothetical business that presumably would comply in the World Bank's report. Like actual compliance, I mean, you might not comply even if it's super easy to comply. Or you might comply even if it's hard to comply. I mean, I comply with the tax laws. The tax laws are a mess, but I still comply.
Right. I mean, and that's why B says has it increased?
Right. So another objection to B is, what if compliance was already 100% in this country?
Well, it can increase to 120%.
No.
No,
You can't have more than 100% compliance. I mean, 100% compliance means everybody is complying.
I see.
You can't comply twice. You either do it or you don't. So if compliance is 100%, then B does nothing. Flip side, what if compliance is 0% because it's a country of criminals? Or what if compliance is 0% because everybody knows that the IRS is totally toothless and won't enforce it anyway? And everybody just goes, I don't care how easy it is to comply. I don't want to pay taxes, so I'm not paying taxes. That still might not matter to the hypothetical business that is presumably complying that the World Bank is using. I think the thing to really take away, Nernemsa, is that the World Bank didn't say that they were looking at actual compliance. They said that they were looking at hypothetical compliance.
Okay. I mean, it says a hypothetical business.
Yes, a hypothetical business, not an actual business, a hypothetical business.
To comply. Okay.
Right. What they're doing is they're saying, okay, let's imagine that you're making shoes and here's your balance sheet, here's your income statement, and it's this business, it's a $20 million revenue, whatever business. Okay, let's look at how it would be to comply with regulations and to pay taxes in all of these various countries. They're going to be looking at the law and what it would take to comply with the law.
Right.
They don't care about whether whether companies in that country actually comply. That's not the point. The point is, how hard would it be for this hypothetical business to comply?
Right. Okay.
Lack of compliance could just be bad moral character or something. It could have nothing to do with the difficulty of compliance. It could just be that they don't want to comply. Maybe the culture of that country is such that nobody wants to comply.
Okay, so it's the difficulty. The issue is the difficulty of compliance, not whether people are compliant or not.
Yeah. How hard would it be for the hypothetical business
Yeah.
to comply?
Yeah, I don't know why it took me so long to make that click. Thank you, though. I appreciate it.
Well, this is an actual level 5 difficulty question. I mean, this is one where I look at it and I go, yeah, that's not the easiest question. That one is there to differentiate the 175s from the 176s. And so it's okay if it takes a minute to wrap your mind around it. But it does, I promise you, make perfect sense. When you get to the root of it, there's really only one answer that you can pick here, because it really matters a lot whether these changes would have affected the hypothetical business. Okay, let's have some fun. We're going to get into a couple of questions that I have never, ever seen before. I'm not going to cheat. I'm just going to do the question and see if the question makes sense. This is my testing to see if this question makes sense. Here we go. A researcher says, studies have shown that individuals who consume a diet rich in omega-3 fatty acids have a lower than average risk of developing depression. That's a correlation. Correlation does not prove causation. So I'm going to be real suspicious here. Like, what are they going to try to conclude? They go, therefore, increasing one's intake of omega-3 fatty acids is likely to be an effective treatment for depression. This researcher is committing one of the LSAT's most common flaws, which is confusing correlation for causation. Just because two things are correlated does not mean that one causes the other. Now, it could be that eating a lot of omega-3 fatty acids absolutely is preventing depression. But it doesn't have to be that way. In fact, it could be the other way around. What if depression makes you, for whatever reason, crave salmon or whatever thing has omega-3 fatty acids in it? If depression caused you to eat salmon, or if depression caused you to eat omega-3s, then eating omega-3s is not going to treat depression, because it's the depression that's making you eat the omega-3s. Oh, sorry. And it's the other way around. Well, wait, hold on. I think I misspoke. If depression makes you hate omega-3s, because it says that having a lot of omega-3s prevents depression. So if you eat omega-3s, it'll cure your depression. Not necessarily, because it's the problem is, what if depression reduces your desire to eat fish? What if what if depression, if I am depressed, what if that makes me want nothing but McDonald's or some shit that has no nutritional value? If that were the case, then eating omega-3s probably is not going to have anything to do with depression. The reason why my omega-3s are low is because I'm depressed. So it's a correlation, therefore causation error. Probably the second most common flaw on the LSAT after confusing sufficient for necessary. My objection is, how do you know it's not the other way around? Another good objection would be, how do you know it's not some other third thing? I mean, it could be that if you live somewhere with bad weather, you have less depression and more access to omega-3s in your diet. If you live somewhere with terrible weather, you have no omega-3s in your diet and you also have depression. But it could be that the depression and the omega-3s have nothing to do with one another. It could just be living somewhere cold gives you depression and lack of omega-3 in your diet. The reasoning is most vulnerable to criticism on the grounds that the argument, what? I am looking for an answer that describes, it's going to say something like, you have inferred causation where only correlation has been shown. It could also say neglects to consider the possibility that depression causes people to avoid eating omega-3s. A, presumes without providing justification that what prevents a condition will also cure it once it is likely to develop. Did they presume that? Did they necessarily assume? Do they have to agree that something that prevents a condition will cure it? No, because there was never anything in evidence about this prevents that, therefore it will cure that. I just don't, that wasn't in the evidence. I can't pick A. B, did they overlook the possibility that a causal relationship between two phenomena implies a correlation between those two phenomena? Other way around. So they didn't overlook that possibility. Oh, and it's backward anyway. So what they did is they said, if there's a correlation, then that implies a causal relationship. They did not overlook the possibility that a causal relationship might have an underlying correlation. It's backward. They didn't do that. Or if they did overlook that possibility, it's not a problem that they overlooked it. It just doesn't correctly describe something that's wrong with the argument. C, did they fail to consider the possibility that the excessive intake of any nutrient might have negative health consequences? I guess they did fail to consider that possibility, but why is that possibility relevant? You know, if you were to come in with like, well, but omega-3s causes cancer or something like that, okay, but it's actually not relevant because the conclusion of the argument was only about whether omega-3s will cure depression. You saying omega-3s causes cancer or obesity or whatever else doesn't matter. Did it or did it not cure your depression? D, did it take for granted that with respect to the effective treatment of a condition, a practice similar to one associated with a lower than average likelihood of that condition is likely to succeed? I think they did take that for granted. I think that that's describing the correlation, therefore causation flaw. They said that if you, they said omega-3s and there was a correlation between omega-3s and low depression. And then they're assuming that, so yeah, if you have the depression, you should eat omega-3s. That'll probably succeed. Yeah, I think the answer is probably D. Let me just make sure I can get rid of E. I don't love the wording of D, but that's not the point. Can I make an argument that it fairly represents what happened in this researcher's argument? I think I can. E, did it confuse necessary for sufficient? Nah, that's the LSAT's most common flaw. If that was the answer, I would have known that that was the answer a mile away. Committing the LSAT's most common flaw, confusing sufficient for necessary, looks like, you know, they would have had to present a premise that said, if you eat omega-3s, you will not be depressed. John isn't depressed, therefore John eats omega-3s. That's just not what they did. E's an easy pass because I know what the sufficient necessary flaw looks like. That's not what this researcher did. Answer is D. Robert, and then Chalet.
Yes, good morning.
Did I get it right? I didn't check the answer.
Yeah, whatever. Of course you did.
I do miss them sometimes. I mean, yeah. What's up?
So let's take a second and a breath and take a look at A. Presumes without providing justification that what prevents a condition. And you're like, well, it didn't say anything about prevention. Well, let's read this one more time. Studies have shown that individuals who consume a diet rich in omega-3s have lower than average risk of developing depression.
Doesn't mean that it prevents it.
Therefore, increasing it could be a treatment.
That's their conclusion, yes.
Right.
That's not in the evidence.
If they're not directly intimating that omega-3 prevented depression, how in the hell are they saying it's going to treat it? Why would they say, therefore, increasing it is going to be a treatment if they're not thinking that it didn't prevent it?
I think I understand what you're saying, but that just doesn't necessarily have to be true. Aren't there?
What else could they be thinking about omega-3s based on what they've said that they would conclude that it would be a likely treatment if they're not thinking that it was preventative?
Aren't there drugs that cure things that don't prevent things?
I'm looking at this. You know, I'm a psychiatrist, so I know the answer to that. But this specific question is, you're looking at why did they decide that omega-3s would be a likely treatment? You're literally now, I mean, just stick with me one more second, please. It's like saying omega-3s exist, therefore they're going to be a treatment. No, it's studies have shown that omega-3s are correlated with people having a decreased risk. Therefore, we should give it to people. It's likely to be a treatment. What else can I infer? And I mean, it's a literal question. What else can I infer from this that they're saying about omega-3s other than it was preventative, therefore it could likely be curative? I mean, a legit question.
Oh, I understand that you're asking a legit question.
I mean, I'm not being sarcastic. That was
No, I know.
Self.
I know. Okay, so the flaw here was clearly your evidence is correlation. You are assuming that there's a causal relationship. The problem with A is that it is not in evidence that there is prevention. That is not part of the evidence. The evidence is correlation. The evidence is not causation. The conclusion is causation. They think that this correlation is causal. They have not presumed that what prevents a condition will cure it because they did not provide evidence that omega-3s prevent this disease. They have
So they made a
merely
massive
provided.
jump. They went just from, oh, this is correlated, it's going to be a treatment.
Correct.
Sweet. That's
That's
it.
not in the evidence, and that's why A is wrong.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Chalet?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I have with A, if you're saying that it's going to lower your risk of developing an illness, isn't that saying that it's going to help like prevent that illness from happening?
Not necessarily, because again, you can have, like, just because two things are correlated, sure, if you fall into this one camp, then you happen to have a lower than average risk of depression. But it could also be like people who are wealthy have a lower risk of depression. That doesn't mean that being wealthy prevents depression. It just means that it's correlated with less depression. There's a difference between just because two things are correlated does not mean that they are causally related at all.
Yeah, did you guys get this? Like when you were making this question, did you like look at another like LSAT question for like reference or?
I have no idea how Ben wrote it.
I think that like lowering the average risk of like developing depression, I don't know if it's like the public health major in me, but
It
like
doesn't say it lowers. It doesn't say it lowers.
It says it lowers the average risk
It
of
doesn't say
developing
it
depression.
lowers. That's not what it says.
Or
it says that
it says people who consume this
have a lower risk. That's correlation, not causation. It doesn't say lowers. It says have a lower. That's correlation, not causation.
It says people who tend to eat this have a lower risk of developing this.
That's correlation. If it's a fact about you that you eat a diet rich in omega-3 acids, then it's also a fact about you that you have a lower than average risk of developing depression. Those two things are correlated. That does not mean that one causes the other. It could just be that people who subscribe to Men's Health magazine tend to both eat a lot of omega-3s and have a lower risk of depression. But that doesn't mean that the omega-3s are lowering your risk of depression. It just means that there is a correlation between those two things.
Okay.
Parker?
Hi, Nathan. Okay, I just had a question. Hold on, okay, there we go. I had a question about D. Would you mind just parsing out what exactly D means? Like, I'm
It's a
just so
convoluted way of saying correlation, therefore causation. I have a feeling Ben went into the labs and came up with the most annoying possible way that he could describe the correlation, therefore causation flaw. Takes for granted that with respect to the effective treatment of a condition, so if you're going to talk about treatment, takes for granted that a practice similar to one associated with a lower than average likelihood of that condition, which associated means correlated. So all it says is, oh, okay, so if you do shit that would put you into that correlation, basically if you eat omega-3s, then now you're also going to succeed in treating your depression.
that makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you, Parker. And I want to go back to Robert as well, because I want to go back to A as well. The researcher never said anything about curing. The researcher only concluded treatment, not curing. And there can be a big difference between treating and curing, as I'm sure you know. And so that's another reason why A is wrong. Spencer and then Evan.
Yeah, two things. Just real quick, a practice similar to one associated. What is that describing? I think someone was trying to say, like, what does each one parse out? And when I was reading it, I picked it just because I knew Ben was writing this, and I'm like, okay, I know that's the wrong way to go about this, but I said it assumes with respect to the effective treatment of a condition, a practice similar, and I'm like, okay, increasing one's intake versus like already having a diet.
Yep.
What's the like the practice similar? I don't
know.
No. Yeah, so and then secondly, I went in with the prediction that like let's say athletes who consume a diet rich in omega-3 fatty acids, like they don't have depression. So that would like explain the reason why this is the way it is, and why this could be flawed. And I didn't see that obviously in the answer choices. And I often have this, I had it happen a couple times during these questions, and I get into this mode of like frantically searching almost of like, okay, like it's not there. I don't know what it is. And your mind goes blank because you don't think you understood it the right way.
Well, you just
I
have to
guess
refuse to pick wrong answers. I get it that you predicted, you made a good prediction, which was, hey, well, what if this is just an artifact of the fact that marathon runners eat a lot of salmon? Maybe, and running marathons also cures depression. Okay. It could be that running a marathon causes you to never have depression. It also causes you to eat a lot of omega-3s because you need omega-3s to recover from your run or whatever. I don't know. I'm not a marathon runner. So that's a good objection to say, nah, this could just be an artifact. Like the correlation is caused by some other thing. And it's not that omega-3s prevent depression. It's that being a distance runner prevents depression and makes you eat omega-3s. That's a fine objection. And the correct answer could have said overlooks this possibility. But there are potentially many correct answers. You have to find the one that's correct, and you have to eliminate the ones that are wrong. A, B, C, and E here are wrong. They do not fairly describe a flaw in this argument. you have to refuse to pick wrong answers. So hopefully then you come back around and you realize that D is a fair allegation. They did what D describes. It's a problem that they did it. That's why that's the answer. Also, when you see correlation, therefore causation, you can have chambered a three-pronged attack. One, correlation doesn't prove causation. Two, how do you know it's not the other way around? Three, how do you know it's not some other thing causing this apparent correlation? Spencer, sounds like you were on number three. The correct answer here was actually just number one. Describe the flaw. You've assumed that because there's a correlation, there's a causation. So all you have to do is just get yourself into the correlation, and that's going to make get yourself into one half of the correlation. It's going to make the other half of the correlation happen. It's just like really so again, this was a correlation versus causation argument. I'm always going to just note that. Two, how do you know it's not the other way around? Three, how do you know it's not alcohol or cigarettes or some other thing that's causing this? Distance running. Evan?
Hey, Nathan. So when I read through this argument, it obviously screamed correlation, therefore causation flaw. But D, to me, it associates, or it kind of tackles that in a roundabout way. But to me, it also attacked an error that I didn't even really notice the first time through, was that just because something could potentially prevent the developing of a issue, then it could be an effective treatment. Is that a correct way of reading the answer? Is it actually doing that, or like pointing out that flaw?
So you're talking about the practice similar to, right?
Yes.
I think the practice similar to refers to increasing your intake of omega-3s. Because that's not the same thing as having a higher than average diet of omega-3s.
Gotcha. Okay. So then in that case, it's probably not doing what I assumed it was doing when I read through it.
I don't think so.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you.
Neha?
It's Neha, but
Neha?
yes.
Okay,
Perfect.
thanks.
I just had a question. I know you mentioned that B was backwards, but I was just wishing or hoping that you could go over that again because I don't 100% get it and like how it's wrong.
They said that because there's a correlation, therefore there must be causation. B says, hey, you're overlooking that if two things are causally related, then there must be a causation. Then there must be a correlation.
Okay.
One, they didn't overlook that because they're clearly trying to say because there's a correlation, therefore there's a causation. Two, that's not the direction. Like they went from correlation, therefore causation, not causation, therefore correlation.
Okay, perfect. So
I think maybe B's wrong twice. I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Okay. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you actually have to know things on the MCAT. You don't have to know anything on the LSAT. You just have to be able to read. Sorry, I'm responding to the chat. That was fun. I got it right. Let's try another one. Archaeologist says, while excavating the ancient settlements of Zephyria, we found the remains of several types of crops. So, notably absent, however, were any remains of wheat, a staple crop in the region when settlement was inhabited. Yeah, okay, so you didn't find any wheat, but you know that it was a staple crop in the region when the settlement was inhabited. So it could have been that this place was an exception to the rule, that they just, for whatever reason, maybe they were super good at corn or they really liked corn or whatever. And so then therefore they didn't grow wheat. But it could also be that they grew wheat. We just didn't find it in the remains of this settlement. right? Just because it's not there doesn't mean they didn't have it. It just means we didn't find it. So maybe it really wasn't there. Maybe it was there and we didn't find it. I just don't know. They go on and they say, some scholars argue that this absence suggests that the settlement did not cultivate wheat. I anticipated that. I said, well, yeah, I mean, that is one interpretation, but there's another interpretation, which is they did cultivate wheat. We just didn't find it. Moreover, the archaeologist says, textual artifacts suggest the settlement traded with nearby settlements where wheat was grown abundantly. That's kind of confusing though, right? Like if we were trading for wheat, then why didn't we find wheat in our settlement? So what was it? Did we grow it and just not find it? Did we trade for it and we're just not finding it? Or did we trade with these nearby settlements but just didn't trade for wheat? I mean, it could be that this is Team Corn here in Zephyria, and they just don't like wheat. I don't know. Which one of the following, if true, most seriously undermines the scholar's argument? So the scholars, those are the people who argue that the absence of wheat in the settlement remain. We didn't find it, therefore we didn't cultivate it. And I need to weaken that line of reasoning. I think that the textual artifacts is maybe just a red herring here, because that's not necessarily coming from the scholars. I think that might be coming from the archaeologists. So I think the part here that I would really want to attack is just because we didn't find it doesn't mean it wasn't there. The settlement of Zephyria is located in an area where the soil is only marginally unsuited for growing wheat. Yeah, but only marginally unsuited is still kind of unsuited. And so I really read A as a better strengthener than I do a weakener. Like A's like, well, it's not that bad. Yeah, but it's still bad. And by the way, we didn't find any wheat, so maybe we didn't grow it because A acknowledges that it's kind of bad for wheat. B, archaeological evidence shows that wheat was one of the primary goods traded in the region during the period in question. It seems to support what the archaeologist believes. I don't know that it has any bearing on what the scholars believe. And anyway, it would tend to support them if they're trying to conclude that this culture or this settlement didn't cultivate wheat. C, the remains of wheat are known to deteriorate more quickly than the remains of other crops found at the settlement site. We found corn, we found rice, we found barley and hops. We found all these other things, but we didn't find wheat. Therefore, they didn't cultivate wheat. C says, yeah, but that's because wheat deteriorates faster than this other stuff. Answer is going to be C. If that's true, it puts those scholars in a bad spot. D, the remains of other crops found at the settlement site were preserved in a way that wheat remains would not be. Okay, so there can be only one. I have to pick one of these two. If C's true, then wheat deteriorates more quickly. If D's true, then these other crops were preserved in a way that wheat remains would not be preserved. But that doesn't mean that the wheat wouldn't still be there. Wheat could be preserved in a different way. Or we still might find wheat remains even if wheat remains weren't preserved. I like C a lot better than D because C says, hey, we know as a fact that wheat deteriorates faster than these crops. D just says, well, these particular crops that we did find, they were preserved in a way that wheat remains wouldn't be preserved. Yeah, but there still could be wheat, like still, why didn't we find, like what, the fact that they did preserve these particular things doesn't mean that they didn't also preserve wheat in some other different way. I don't think I can pick D. I think the answer here has to be C. E, the settlement's agricultural records, which include the types of crops grown, have yet to be fully deciphered. Uh, who cares? What's that have to do with anything? Like the records, I don't care. You know, they say this settlement didn't cultivate wheat. Why? Because we didn't find it. C says, yeah, but we know that wheat remains deteriorate quickly. D just says, yeah, I mean, even if D's true, okay? So imagine D's true. Well, these other crops were preserved in a way that wheat remains would not be preserved. Yeah, but there is evidence that these crops were here. There's no evidence that wheat was ever here. You saying, look at these crops and how they were preserved, and wheat wouldn't have been preserved that way. Still, wheat could have been preserved in any other way, or maybe wheat doesn't even need to be preserved and you still would find it. Um, I like C. C seems like a very clear, straightforward weakener. D feels like something that I can weasel out of. And because of that, I got to pick C, not D. Mia.
I have a quick question about E. I see now how you mentioned that like the textual artifacts part is sort of just like a red herring because we don't know the scholars said that. If the argument did say like the scholars also say that, you know, the textual artifacts, if they explicitly say that the scholars like cite that as evidence, would E be a stronger answer, or could we still not like assume that agricultural records are textual artifacts?
No, textual artifacts is like text. So the agricultural records are clearly textual artifacts.
Okay. Okay.
But if that was the scholars, if that was part of the scholars argument, right? If it said, moreover, scholars say, textual artifacts suggest the settlement traded with nearby settlements where wheat was grown abundantly. So what if E is true? The settlement's agricultural records have yet to be fully deciphered. How's that? So what?
Well, couldn't it show that like maybe in the undeciphered parts there is evidence that, I don't know, they were growing it themselves?
Yeah, but that's so speculative. I mean, the
Yeah.
textual artifacts already say, hey, they were trading with nearby settlements that grew a lot of wheat. That does seem to support the idea that maybe we weren't growing wheat. If we were trading with them, they grow abundant wheat. There's no wheat found in our settlement. Maybe we were trading for wheat. Although I still would want to say, but then if we were trading for wheat, why didn't we find wheat in our settlement? I just, even if that is part of the scholar's statement, I still don't think E does anything.
Okay.
Martin?
Nate, I'm reading, I'm going back to B, and I'm thinking about this in light of the understanding that, yes, there weren't, any remains of wheat that were found in the area. However, if it's true that archaeological evidence shows that wheat was primary good traded in the region, wouldn't that reasonably, be considered as somewhat of a weakener to that conclusion that the scholars are presenting?
Maybe. I mean, just because it was grown in the region doesn't mean that we had to grow it, though.
Okay.
I mean, like, there's a lot of lettuce grown around the central coast of California where I spend a lot of time. That doesn't mean I grow lettuce.
Okay. Okay. So you read that as a strengthener you mentioned, is that correct?
Well, I think that's their point, isn't it? That they say moreover. You don't say moreover unless you mean here's more evidence. So they
Okay.
just provided evidence, or their claim at least, like there was evidence that, hey, we found these other crops, but we didn't find wheat. Therefore, I conclude we didn't grow wheat. Moreover, we traded a lot with people who did grow wheat.
Hmm.
The moreover there is tipping their hand that like they think that helps their argument.
Yeah.
And I agree, although it does make me confused. If we were trading for wheat, why didn't we find wheat?
Sure. Well, when I see that last segment there, I know you mentioned it in like a red herring, but they didn't necessarily say that they were trading for wheat.
Right. That's true too. We
right.
don't know that we were trading for wheat, but that's what they meant.
Sure. Okay. All right.
Right. Because they're trying to conclude, the scholars are trying to conclude we didn't cultivate wheat.
Sure.
But that doesn't mean we didn't trade for it. And saying we traded for it could be evidence in favor of we didn't cultivate it. Why? Because we could trade for it. Why would we cultivate it if we could just trade for it?
So your logic just your logic when you look at B, the reason why you do not like B is what exactly?
Oh, I feel like it would strengthen more than it would weaken. I know we were trading with a settlement where wheat was grown abundantly. B says wheat was traded abundantly. Well, if we were trading with people who grew wheat, and if wheat was commonly traded, then it makes it more likely that I'm trading for wheat, which supports the idea that I wasn't cultivating it.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you. I appreciate it. It makes more sense.
Robert?
Yes, thank you. Just quick. One of the things that actually, I think simplified this for me is if we look at the question, which one of the following, if true, most seriously undermines the scholar's argument? The way I read it is the scholar's argument is just that one sentence. Some scholars argue that the absence suggests that the settlement didn't cultivate wheat. And the rest, like the whole rest of the things is a massive herring. And so,
well, the last sentence, but not the previous part,
right?
Because
everything that follows, it could literally say,
right.
moreover, the Encyclopedia Britannica said
right.
that blah 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 blah. So that is the thing that finally helped me realize D actually had nothing to do with that very specific conclusion compared to C. And why
But
C
D
was
is about
right.
the remains. Yeah, I don't agree, because this following some scholars argue that this
absence,
which is the
right,
previous sentence.
No, I'm saying that yes, that absence suggests, but that's the conclusion. That is the conclusion. That's why D doesn't address that. Delta answered, does not address that.
Doesn't address what?
It doesn't address the scholar's argument.
Why not? The scholar's argument is because we found other crops,
right,
and didn't find wheat, therefore we didn't cultivate wheat.
Right.
How is D not about that argument?
Exactly what you said earlier. I guess you changed your mind. The way that they happen to be preserved doesn't have anything to do with whether they cultivated it or not.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Now I follow. Yeah, preservation, but deterioration matters a lot, right? Because like C is so straightforwardly saying wheat deteriorates fast. Maybe we didn't find it because wheat deteriorates fast.
C just flat answers it.
Right. While D says, well, let's look at the evidence that we do have. And the evidence that we do have was preserved in some certain sort of a way. Yeah, I agree with you now, Robert. I think I understand what you're saying. And I think you're right that it's like that preservation bit is just like, hey, look, does the absence of wheat prove we didn't cultivate wheat? You saying, well, but the rice was preserved in this certain sort of a way, and wheat wouldn't have been preserved in that sort of a way. Not nearly as good as wheat deteriorates.
And that's certainly not going to suggest by itself that they didn't cultivate it and that they had to bring it in. That would just give us a little more information about why it may not be here right now. But it's just, yeah, it's I had trouble between C and D at first, and then
So did I. And if D would have been before C, I would have been pretty strongly in favor of it, because I would have said, oh, if these things like imagine, let's say that it was this settlement was covered under a layer of volcanic ash. What if a layer of volcanic ash perfectly preserves rice and corn, but doesn't preserve wheat?
Yep.
In that case, that seems like a pretty devastating conclusion, a pretty devastating weakener. I'm actually not sure what Ben had in mind with D. I think that this question probably needs to be tweaked a little bit, because the LSAT doesn't really have a lot of good second bests. And I could clearly tell, like, this to me looks like D is a weakener, but C is clearly meant to be the correct answer and a better weakener. But that almost never happens on the actual test, that there's like a good weakener and an okay weakener, or like a good weakener and like a kind of okay weakener, which I still read D as like, yeah, I mean, I see what you're saying there. That like, if these things were preserved in a way that wheat wouldn't have been preserved, like my volcano example, then that seems like it weakens their logic. So I'll have to get back with Ben and see what he thinks about D. James?
Let us know.
I went between C and D for a minute, but I quickly went back to C. And the reason I went back to C is because when I read D, one more time, the remains of other crops found at the settlement site were preserved in a way that wheat remains would not be. I kind of felt like I would have to assume a lot, like, okay, why was all the other crops preserved over wheat? Did they have something? Were they not trying to preserve the wheat? So I felt myself like kind of trying to put words in the author's mouth and trying to presume something, and I just was like, no, that it has to be C then, because C was too straightforward. That's why I settled on C, but D did kind of trip me up a little bit, and I could see how everyone could have picked that. But
If C wasn't there, I would pick D, and I wouldn't really even think twice about it. So that's why I think that this maybe isn't that great of a question. We probably need to work on this one a little bit more. Okay, I'm 69 minutes overtime, so I'm going to wrap up class here. Thank you, nerds, 15 of you out of like 60, for sticking around for the full all of these fake questions that Ben invented. I'm going to take us off the record here, and then I'll take Christopher's question, and then I gotta go.